Hi, my name is TTJ Richie and welcome to my online tutorials. Our discussion on discrete mathematics today will be on graphs. Before the video will end, I will take you through what a graph of a relation means. Then we'll also talk about the types of graphs of a relation that we have. This will be a very interesting engagement, so please come along. So when we talk of a graph of a relation G, the graph of the relation G is given as G equal to V comma E, where V is the vertex and the E is the edge. So this simply means that every graph of a relation is having a vertex and an edge. That is very simple. So we say that this means that every graph of a relation has a vertex and an edge. What is the vertex and what is an edge? For instance, we have this simple graph. This is called the vertex for singular, vertices for plural, and this is the edge. So an edge connects two vertices, if you can put it. A vertex is also called, remember, a vertex is also called the nodes. So take a very good notice of it. A vertex is also called the node. Then an edge is also called links or arcs. So a vertex is also called a node and an edge is called links or arcs. So the next stop is the types of graphs that we have. So our next stop is the types of graph of a relation. Please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It is the only way you can help promote my YouTube channel so that I can record more mathematical content for you. So I want to talk of types of graph of a relation. We have 5 types of those graphs. We have simple graphs, we have multi-graph, side-on graphs, directed graphs, and multi-directed graphs. I want to talk of simple graph. What are they? What's a diagram representing simple graphs? On top of multi-graphs, what are they? What is the diagram representing multi-graph? On top of side-on graphs, what are they? What's a diagram representing side-on graph? Then on top of directed graphs, what's a directed graph? And a diagram representing directed graph, as well as multi-directed graphs. So that's the next thing we'll look at. We'll take all these and try to explain them one after the other. So before we look at the graphs one by one, what are they? Let me explain it. So when we say a graph is having directed edge, it means the edges are directed with arrows. I hope you get that. So this is when a graph is having directed edges, you see that the edges will be directed. Then when we say a graph is having a multiple edge, that means the graph look like this. It's having multiple edges like that. So this graph is having multiple edges. That means it have 2 or more edges at one side. So this graph is having multi edges. Now when we say a graph is having self-loop, this is how it looks like. I hope you get it. That means when we label the vertices A, B, C, that means B relates itself. That's a self-loop. So that leads us to our first type of graph, which is a simple graph. When we talk of simple graphs has no multi-edges. They don't have directed edges. Neither do they have self-loops. So if you have a graph that has no multi-edges, that has no directed edge, and has no self-loop, then we refer to that graph as a simple graph. So we say a simple graph is a graph that has no directed edges, no multi-edges, and also no self-loops. So look at this graph. The graph has no multi-edges. It doesn't have directed edges. The edges are not directed. Neither is it having a self-loop. So if you miss that type of graph, we say the graph is a simple graph. I hope you get that. Our next stop is a multi-graph. So our next stop is multi-graphs. So on top of multi-graphs, remember in simple graph, we said we don't have multiple edges. We don't have directed edges, neither do we have self-loops. But in multi-graphs, we can have multi-edges, but we can't have a self-loop and directed edges. So we say that multi-graph is a graph that has two or more multi-edges, but has no self-loop and the edges are not directed. So you can see this graph is having multiple edges. It doesn't have a self-loop and the edges are not directed. When you meet such type of graph, we call it multi-graph. Our next graph is called side-on graphs. So remember in simple graphs, we say it doesn't have directed edges, no multiple edge, and no self-loop. But in multi-graphs, we have multi-edges. We don't have a self-loop, neither do we have directed edges. But in side-on graphs, we can have multiple edges, we can have self-loops. The only thing we can have in side-on graphs is directed edges. So we say side-on graph is a graph with multi-edges and self-loop, but the edges are not directed. So if you meet this kind of graph, you see that we have multi-edges here, we have a self-loop. The only thing that is missing is that the edges are not directed. When you meet such type of a graph, we call it side-on graph. So our next stop is a directed graphs. So remember, in multi-graphs, side-on graphs, and simple graphs, the edges are not directed. But in directed graph, it's a graph with directed edges, and sometimes with self-loop. However, it has no multi-directed edges. So in directed edge, the directed graphs, the only thing that is missing is that we don't have a multi-directed edge. That means the edges are not multiple. It doesn't have two or more edges. It has only one directed edge, and sometimes with self-loop. So if a graph has just single directed edges, with or without a self-loop, it is called directed graphs. Our next stop is multi-directed graphs. So remember, we said directed graphs have directed edges and they sometimes have self-loops. So directed graphs are graphs with directed edges, with or without self-loop. However, they don't have multi-directed edges. So when a graph is having a multi-directed edge with or without a self-loop, then that graph is called a multi-directed graph. So we say multi-directed graph is a graph with multi-directed edges with or without self-loops. So this type of graph is called a multi-directed graph. You see that the edges are directed, then the edges are multiple. That means it has two or more edges, then it also has a self-loop. So when you meet such graphs that have multi-directed edges, we call them multi-directed graphs. I hope you get that. So what have we been looking at so far? We have been looking at the type of graphs, and we said we have 5 types of graphs. That's a simple graph, multi-graph, side-on graphs, directed graphs, and multi-directed graphs. We said that when the edges of a graph are not directed, they are either simple graphs, multi-graph, or side-on graph. When the edges are directed, then they are either directed graphs or multi-directed graphs. Simple graphs are graphs that don't have multi-edges. The edges are not directed, neither are they multiple, and they don't have self-loops. Then when we talk of multi-graphs are graphs with multiple edges, but they don't have self-loops, and the edges are also not directed. Then when we talk of side-on graphs have multi-edges. They have self-loops. The only thing that is missing is that the edges are not directed. And directed graphs, the edges are directed, but the edges are not multi-directed, and they may or may not have a self-loop. The multi-directed graphs are graphs with multiple directed edges or multi-directed edges with or without a self-loop. So that's what we have been talking about so far. Now let's see if we have really understood. They say identify the type of graphs below. So 5 types of graphs that we have learned are drilled here, and we are asked to identify that 5 types of graphs. You can pause the video and try to see if you get a name for all the 5 graphs. After that, you compare your answers with mine. Now compare answers. Let's look at the first one. So we analyze. The first graph has no directed edges. The edges are not directed. So if the edges are not directed, they are either simple graphs, multi-graphs, or side-on graphs. Now, simple graphs don't have multiple edges, neither do they have self-loop. But look at this graph. The graph is having multi-edges and is having self-loop. So this graph is not a simple graph. Is it a multi-graph? No, it is not a multi-graph. Though it's having a multiple edges, but it's having self-loop. Multi-graphs don't have self-loop. So therefore, this graph is a side-on graph. So this is called a side-on graph. I hope you had the answer correct. Now let's look at the second one, which is 2. So you see the second one, it has directed edge. If it's having directed edge, it's not a simple graph. It's not a side-on graph. Neither is it a multi-graph. It is either a directed graph or a multi-directed graph. So this graph has multiple edges and the edges are directed. Then it is a multi-directed graph. So we say this is a multi-directed graph. I hope you get that. Now let's look at the third one. So this graph doesn't have a directed edge. It doesn't have a multi-edge. Neither is it having a self-loop. Then this is a simple graph. It's a simple graph. Please do well to check out my videos on types of simple graphs that we have. Now let's look at this. This graph is having multi-edges. The edges are not though directed. Neither is it having a self-loop. Then this is a multi-graph. This is called a multi-graph. And the last but not the least, the fifth one. Look at it. It's having a directed edge and it's having a self-loop. It's not having a multi-directed edge. Then this is a directed graph. A directed graph. I hope you understand all these things. Well, we end it here today. Please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel before you sign up. Until we meet again, my name is Tete Jacob C. Richard.